welcome to my channel. My name is Adam W. Rodriguez, and I am your host here at the Art of AWR. Today I'm going to be doing my October wrap-up, and it's like November 20-something. But I am kind of a slave to format. I like to do a wrap-up and then lead into the month's videos, and that's what I'm going to do here. So before I begin, I would like to invite you to subscribe to my channel. If you like videos about books and comic books and art and creativity in general, please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a like and then hit that bell so that you get new notifications every time a new episode drops. Awesome. Let's do October wrap up. I like the echo effect. What can I say? All right, let's talk first about comics that I read in October. I read a bunch of comics. Most of the comics that I have read this last month were like part of ongoing series, and I like to do my reviews after at least, a chunk or a story arc has finally kind of seen its way through, and none of that's really happened. But what did happen was I was going through my comic book carousel, and I found some books that I collected several years ago, back in 2015, that I hadn't read yet. And that were these. Lando. Now, this was in 2015, right when Disney purchased the Star Wars franchise. And they had already purchased Marvel, and they had decided to put out a bunch of new comic books to kind of like add to the canon. And they were like getting rid of some old canon, and now they were starting to add canon. So I was really interested, and I bought a whole bunch of the books. And actually, most of them were not very good at all. I remember liking the Darth Vader ones, and I was thinking about maybe even doing a review of the original Darth Vaders that came out in 2015. But anyway, I remember folks saying that the Lando series was really good. It was only 5 books long, and I ended up collecting all of them, and then I forgot about them. So here I am 7 years later, finally reading these bad boys. This was a really fun series. It's about Lando Calrissian and the character Lobot. You meet Lobot in Empire Strikes Back. He's kind of this brief character that Lando, has some kind of connection with. You get to understand a little bit more about their connection here in this book. What I really like is it adds to the canon a little bit. You understand a little bit more about Lobot, and this is a really fun heist book where Lando and Lobot end up creating a small team of, colorful rogues, and they go out and they steal a ship, and they soon find out that this ship is actually a pleasure yacht. It's a starship, not like a boat yacht, but like a starship yacht class that belongs to Emperor Palpatine. And then all sorts of crazy stuff ensues. And it only happens in 5 issues, and it actually is quite great. It's a good standalone Lando story, and I liked it a lot. I would give this bad boy easily an 8 out of 10, if maybe 8.5. I mean, it's encroaching on that 9, really. I mean, maybe I should give it a 9. Okay, cool. It's a 9 because it adds to the canon. So when you watch Empire Strikes Back and you meet Lobot, you've got this kind of cool backstory that enriches your experience. And the backstory is actually quite cool, so it makes it all the more richer, right? So I really enjoyed this. The writer was a guy, or it was right named Soule, S-O-U-L-E, Charles Soule. And the artist is Alex Maleev. The art is excellent as well. This guy really, really captures the Billy D. Williams look in all of the artwork. And it, carries over into the interior art as well. It's a very good book. It's super solid, and people should read it. I highly suggest it to anybody. 9 out of 10 Lando Star Wars book. Awesome. That's the only comic books that I'm really going to touch on about October. Like I said, I did read some other stuff, but nothing complete. I want to wait until a story arc at least has come to its full fruition before I talk about it and rate it. So let's talk about novels that I read in October. Here we go. Novels that I read in October. The first one that I finished, because I went on a spooky book rabbit hole, right? I usually October, I don't like specifically do spooky books, but I've been watching so much BookTube and everybody gearing up for spooky book season, so I ended up just like jumping on that bandwagon. Apparently, I am quite successful to the BookTube bandwagon. Anyway, the first book I read was The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore, or Endore. I'm not really too sure how to pronounce his name. This was a really, really cool book. This book has been hailed by some critics as the Bram Stoker's Dracula of werewolf literature. And I can totally see why. Guy Endore's writing style is very, very reminiscent of classic literature. I could stand to use a little bit more poetry, but the book itself is quite good. It doesn't fall into totally standard werewolf tropes. The character that ends up being the werewolf is not a man who was bitten by a werewolf and then dreading the next full moon kind of a story arc. Instead, this is a man who is cursed because his family has just very, very dark dealings, even far back into his ancestry. The very top of the book talks about his ancestors and part of this kind of barbaric feud that they had. And it was just full of blood and murder and barbarism and savagery. And then it kind of fast forwards to the werewolf's father, who is a priest that ends up raping the werewolf's mother. The werewolf himself is a product of rape. And it's dark. The boy is just sort of born cursed. And that kind of follows into some of the old werewolf lore. These kind of pacts with the devil is what makes a person a werewolf. Not necessarily the bite of a lycanthrope that makes you turn into a werewolf yourself. So this book takes place during the siege of Paris, which I believe is in the 1870s, 75, 76, somewhere in there, where the Franks were fighting the Prussians, and the Prussians were sieging Paris itself. And, the werewolf character is one of the soldiers. I really enjoyed the historical aspects that they put in here. There's a lot of name dropping of familiar people from history. It centers largely around this one young man who is a werewolf, but it does talk heavily about his upbringing. And in his upbringing, he has this sort of surrogate uncle who reluctantly becomes a priest himself. And this uncle sort of figures out the character's malady, that he himself is a werewolf. And he begins to try to help this character to kind of navigate his affliction. And then later on, the werewolf runs to Paris. He joins the army, and then his surrogate uncle, the priest, gives chase. And the rest of the story sort of ensues with him trying to find him. But you do get plenty of chapters where it's just the werewolf dealing with being a werewolf and a soldier and just being a young man who wants to be accepted and loved and all of that kind of stuff. So I really think that it was a very rich, full book, and I liked it a lot. I would give it an 8 out of 10. I definitely wanted there to be a little bit more excitement, and maybe that's a little much to ask. I read Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I compare it to it a lot because, like I said, some of the critics compared Bram Stoker's Dracula to this book, and I didn't get as much action as I wanted out of Bram Stoker's Dracula as well. But I would put this on par with a Bram Stoker's Dracula as far as I'm concerned. It was a good book. So 8 out of 10, Werewolf of Paris. I am probably going to do a longer review on this later on, so look out for that. So after I read Werewolf of Paris, I continued into my spooky reading, and I picked up my short stories, the horror stories of Robert E. Howard. You saw this one in the last monthly review. This has been sort of a go-to short story book that I've just kind of been burning into because I really love it. Robert E. Howard is one of my favorite authors, and I was having a conversation the other day with a friend of mine. We had just finished rehearsals, and we were talking about books that we have been reading, and we started talking about H.P. Lovecraft at one point, And we were kind of talking about like how H.P. Lovecraft, how he has a great mythos, great concepts, but like his narrating style, his storytelling is not terribly strong. And I remember like mentioning, hey, you know who tells a good H.P. Lovecraft story? Robert E. Howard. And then we kind of like spiraled from there and had this really cool conversation. So when I got home, I was like, I need to read some short stories that Robert Howard wrote in the H.P. Lovecraft universe. Because Howard and Lovecraft were correspondents. They wrote letters to each other. And there was this sort of open invitation that Lovecraft had with authors that he corresponded with, in that he wanted them to write stories in the Cthulhu mythos, in the Cthulhu universe. And Robert Howard was one of the guys who did it. So I found some of the stories that he wrote in the Cthulhu universe. One of which, the first one that I read, was a story called Out of the Deep, which, I mean, just sounds like a title that H.P. Lovecraft would have. A tale of Faring Town. You can see the picture of this kind of town, that's blighted by a storm of some kind, sitting there on the shore. Very, very Lovecraft. The story is about a body that washes ashore one day, and the townsfolk come out, they see this corpse, they recognize who it is. The corpse's wife, after examining it, starts to believe that this isn't actually her husband at all, but other people are like, it's obviously your husband. The story takes place kind of in the turn of the century, so it's like, late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. They take the corpse to the person's house, the corpse's house. They put him in a coffin, set him on a table, and he's on display. That's kind of how they did it back then. They would set up a coffin with the corpse in it, and people would come into the house and kind of pay their respects, right? So they do this. And then after everyone leaves, the corpse is left there overnight, and all sorts of creepy Lovecraftian things ensue afterwards. It kind of reads like Shadow over Innsmouth to a degree. But told in that kind of more poetic style of Robert E. Howard. Lovecraft has great atmospheric poetry, and I think Robert Howard is a slightly better poet and a slightly better narrative writer. So he takes what Lovecraft has already built, has already designed, and I think makes it a little bit more readable and engaging. So Robert Howard is an excellent Lovecraft writer. So I couldn't get enough. I ended up reading another story written by Howard in Lovecraft universe, and that's this one. It's called The Thing on the Roof. It's got this kind of cool mummy on the cover there, this art. If you want me to like a horror story, call it The Thing in Something. You know what I mean? The thing in the woods, the thing in the mountains, the thing under my bed. I'm like already like, I'm here for this. I want to know more of this amorphous thing that's building in my mind, this horror. I love it. This particular story definitely reads more like a Lovecraft story. It's about a guy who is a aficionado of old tomes, old books. He's like an anthropologist or an archaeologist or somewhere in between. He's contacted by an old rival. This rival had tried to discredit some of his earlier works, and they ended up kind of like making amends. They get together, and this rival asks this guy to get his hands on this old, dark tome. The guy eventually agrees and gets the tome to him. And so the story starts to pick up after this guy has waited a few years, and he finally tries to contact this guy again. He finds out that the book that he got for him was going to be used to try to find this old archaeological site. And at this site, there is this ancient treasure of some kind. He goes, he meets up with his friend and starts to ask him, hey, did you find what you were looking for? And in that moment, something happens. There's a thing on the roof. And I'm not going to get into what happens at the end. It's definitely very Lovecraftian and told in a slightly more poetic and engaging way because Robert Howard wrote it. It's wonderful stuff. I'm thinking about doing a whole review on just Robert E. Howard doing Lovecraft universe stories. So keep your eyes open for that. Let me know in the comments if that's something that you would be interested in watching. I did end up reading another short story in this book. It is called The Dream Snake. You can see that really cool piece of black and white artwork. It's not necessarily a Lovecraftian style story. It's kind of an old school trope about a guy who dreams about this wraith-like snake, and every subsequent dream, the snake gets closer and closer and closer to him. And it's an old trope. I think you can kind of figure out where it leads, but it's told in such a masterful way because Robert E. Howard is an amazing storyteller. Most people tend to associate Robert E. Howard with just being a like pulp adventure author, but honestly, he was a great horror writer as well. So great credit to where credit is due. Robert Howard is, like I said, one of my favorite authors to read. All right, I read those. Another spooky book that I read in October is this one, The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. Now, Stephen Graham Jones has been somebody that friends of mine have been suggesting for a while. He's a Native American author who writes horror stories, and the monsters in these horror stories are creatures from Native American folklore. Now, I myself love folklore of all kinds, and I've definitely read a lot of Native American folklore. The monster that is featured in this book is a creature that I'm very familiar with, actually. I'm not going to name it here, although they name it pretty early in the book itself, but I'm not going to name what the creature actually is. But it's really great seeing a Native American author making modern horror with old Native American folkloric creatures. I think it's fascinating and wonderful. And Stephen Graham Jones is a really cool author. This is the first book of his that I've read, and I've already ordered another one of his books. So he might be a new fave as far as horror authors are concerned. This is a really cool book. I ended up giving this bad boy a 8 out of 10. Mostly because I find that, and I find this a lot with more modern horror writers, is that there's sort of a lack of poetry. There's a sort of dryness to the narrative style that, I mean, I'm the kind of guy who likes poetry. I love flowery language. I love a good metaphor. I love it when people personify things and create just more figures of phrase and figures of speech. And I wish that there was a little bit more of that in this. And that's just kind of a personal preference. That's why I give it an 8 out of 10. It's still a solid book. And once again, I get very excited when I see obscure monsters being used well and correctly. And that's what Stephen Graham Jones does here. This is a great book. People should read it. Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Indians. And that's about it, although I did get a little further into Anglos and Mexicans. It's some nonfiction that I'm reading for a class that I'm doing. I was talking about maybe doing a review of this book, but now I kind of want to do it less and less, because the further into it I've gotten, the more of the author's bias that I've been dealing with, and I'm starting to like it a lot less. So I don't know. I think I'm going to write my report for my class, and then I'm going to put the book down. But it is something that I have been reading here in October. So that's that. I've already read a couple of books here in November as well, and I want to get into those. I've got some reviews I want to do. I just wanted to start off with this wrap up, and let's talk about plays. That'll be the final thing that I usually end up talking about on these wrap ups. I've watched a lot of plays. Most of them were world premieres, and some of them were absolutely amazing. You guys, go watch local theater. It's kind of a grab bag. Sometimes you're not going to watch something good, but sometimes you end up watching something amazing. And that is one of the best things about local kind of community style theater, is you've got this kind of laboratory of ideas and concepts and writers who are just starting to kind of come into their own. So you're watching these ideas form before your very eyes, and I think it's awesome. One of the plays that I did watch this month is something that I can talk about because it's old school, public domain. William Shakespeare's Hamlet. If you're not familiar with Hamlet, well, you've been hiding under a rock somewhere. It's a pretty standard, quintessential Shakespearean play. When people talk about Shakespeare, Hamlet's one of the first things people bring up. Hamlet is an excellent story. I love it because it's a story about a man dancing on the edge of madness. I really dig tales like that, and Hamlet doesn't disappoint in that regard. If you don't know what it's about, I'll give you a brief synopsis. It's about a Danish prince whose father has recently died mysteriously, and the prince doesn't think he died of natural causes. Two of his friends who are guarding the walls of the castle sees this ghost roaming about the castle walls, and they recognize it as Hamlet's dead father. They tell Hamlet, hey, your father's ghost is roaming the walls. And Hamlet eventually goes out wandering and runs into this ghost, and the ghost tells Hamlet that he was murdered. And he was murdered by Hamlet's uncle. And Hamlet's uncle has recently married Hamlet's mother and taken over, and he is now the king of Denmark. And that's where the story begins to turn into this great seeming madness that overcomes Hamlet. He starts to lose his mind and act crazy, and people are wondering if he's faking it, wondering if he's actually gone completely insane. There's some love interest, there's some suicide, there's accidental murder, there's some murder that is very, very much premeditated, and it ends in a pile of bodies. It's a wonderful, wonderful tale. Shakespeare can be a bit long. Abridged versions might be the best way to go with some of this kind of stuff. But I will say this, I personally believe that Shakespeare is better watched than read. If reading Shakespeare is great, and you should read Shakespeare. But definitely go watch it. Once every 2 or 3 years, somewhere close to you, there's going to be somebody doing a production of Hamlet. Go and watch it, even if it's bad. The story itself kind of carries itself. You know what I mean? So Hamlet is just one of those Shakespeare tales that I think everybody should experience. Check it out. It's good stuff. Go watch local theater, you guys. That is where creativity goes to flourish. Makes people curious by watching other ideas, by watching other lifestyles, by just experiencing diversity in an enclosed space in the dark and watching it under lights. I love it. It's just the creative process in living form. Go watch local theater. It's good for the brain. Awesome. I think I've gone on enough, and I've told you pretty much everything that I've read in the month of October. I hope you enjoyed this here video. I do know I enjoyed making it. Keep your eyes peeled for some reviews because they're coming up the pipe. I'm probably going to even do a few more book tags because I really enjoy doing those. Until next time, folks, I will see you and check you later. Ciao.